Welcome, everyone. My name is Peter Drobak, and I'm the director of the Scholl Center for Social Entrepreneurship here in Oxford. I wish we were all here together, but of course, circumstances have scuppered those plans. I'm really pleased to be here today with all of you and with our friends at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue for this session on social listening and what that means in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I'm excited to introduce our speakers and set up the conversation in a moment. But first, I would like to welcome our friend Sandy Hertz from the Skoll Foundation to say a few words. Sandy's the Director of Global Partnerships at the Skoll Foundation. She is our main kind of partner and liaison between the center here in Oxford and the foundation in Palo Alto. And she and the rest of the amazing team at the Skoll Foundation have been working day and night over the last several weeks since making the really difficult but necessary decision to cancel the forum in Oxford to put together this phenomenal program over the course of the week. And I hope you've all been participating in a lot of sessions. It's been really so fun for me to have all these new voices from all over the world being a part of it this year. So Sandy, if you're there, pop in and say hello.
I am here. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. So as Peter said, thank you very much. I am Sandy Hertz. I'm on the Skoll Foundation team, and I have the privilege of working closely with the folks at the Skoll Center. I'm excited to join you on the virtual Skoll World Forum Week event, this event hosted by Peter and the Skoll Center team. As you may know, the Skoll World Forum takes place each spring in Oxford. It brings together more than 1,200 leaders from across the social entrepreneurship, philanthropy, and social change landscape for a week of learning and networking. And this year we had to cancel the forum because of the coronavirus. But you know, when life gives you lemons, you make lemonade. And it's been really exciting to see what's possible when we opened up the Skoll World Forum platform in a virtual way. To voices from all over the world, and we couldn't be more excited. Like many of you, our team is now working 100% remotely and finding new ways to balance work with the health of our families and communities and the global community. This year, the forum's theme is collective strength. We thought there was no better way to reflect that theme than to have our global network design and build this new Forum Week experience together. More than 80 organizations have contributed virtual events, and the newly imagined forum taking place this week, including this one. And to follow along, we're using the hashtag SkollGoesVirtual, and we hope for you to do the same. In addition to dozens of independently hosted events taking place this week, we would love to have you join us tomorrow, April 2nd at 4 p.m. British Summer Time for the Skoll Awards broadcast, where we will reveal this year's Skoll Awards for Social Entrepreneurship. You can tune in at skoll.org/live. And with that, I'd like to turn it back to Peter. I can't wait for the session to start. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Sandy. And for all of you out there, I've just put the website into the chat. If you want to see the full schedule for events this week, there are over 100 publicly accessible events happening all week long. It's an embarrassment of riches. And so do check it out. You can also sign up to join the Skoll community virtually for the forum this year by entering your own information. And it is a searchable database by country, by sector, by SDG for you to meet lots of other folks that you can make common cause with. So do check it out and participate. And I'll just second the suggestion that you tune in tomorrow for the Skoll Awards. I of course don't know anything about the organizations that will win awards because that's highly classified information, but they're amazing, and we all could use a little bit of good news right now and a little bit of a distraction from some other stuff. And I think it's going to be just the kind of balm that a lot of us need. So do check it out. Okay. Let's get started. This is going to be a really fun, well, fun is maybe not the right word. It's going to be a super interesting conversation. I think it'll be fun too, though it's going to cover some difficult topics. It's about social listening and what that means in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. And really, what does that all mean? You know, I've been as a person with a global health background, pretty busy, like a lot of other people, engaging around this epidemic and now pandemic for the last couple of months. And, you know, this is one of those things where none of us are safe from the virus until we're all safe from the virus, right? It's a big collective action problem. And a lot of us have been really hopeful that out of this crisis can can come some kind of opportunity to come together in ways we haven't been able to before, right? And, there's that sort of famous quote attributed to everyone from Churchill to Rahm Emanuel that you should never let a good crisis go to waste. And so we've had lots of conversation, and many this week, about, is this a moment we can finally break through and dialogue around universal health coverage, around climate change, around social protection for the most vulnerable? And those are really important conversations and work that's happening. Unfortunately, it's not just the good guys, so to speak, who are viewing the situation this way. And something that's really troubled me as just an interested observer over the last several weeks is the way that we've seemed to start to polarize along very familiar lines in the media and in social media and elsewhere in our dialogue. And this is the sort of crisis that's either going to bring us all together or it's going to kind of push us further apart. And, this goes back to early February when I had a conversation with a good friend in London who is a really smart, thoughtful, reasonable, well-educated person who called me up and said, "Hey, have you seen this this thing about Bill Gates and the research he was doing, and it looks like he may be responsible for this new virus. What do you think about that? Could you check into it for me?" And I thought, what are you talking about? That's crazy. And of course it is, and it was crazy, but that was just one of many, many, many sort of conspiracy theories and quack remedies and other kinds of things that have sprung up since then. We've also seen kind of this interesting evolution in sort of how different sort of media outlets in different sectors of the public conversation have evolved. I think a lot of us in the West kind of moved from "it's not a problem," or at least "it's not our problem," to "oh my gosh, it's a problem, but maybe it won't be a really big problem," to "okay, it's a really big problem." But then you start to see some familiar kind of lines of attack coming in. We've seen, political dialogue about the Chinese blaming the Americans blaming the Chinese, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Folks like Anthony Fauci being attacked, sort of someone who's one of the most respected public health figures in the world, who's been at this with every kind of president for 40 years, being attacked and vilified. And where is some of that stuff coming from? And so I just sort of observed this with some concern, right? That we start to be seeing all the same dynamics that we've seen with Brexit and the 2016 US elections and, many, many, many other things around the world, that it kind of feels like everyone's retreating into some of those same corners. And that was just a pattern. And in conversations with our guests today, what I've come to learn is that there's a good reason for that, right? The risk that we face is there could be an acceleration of some of the most noxious and pernicious trends that are happening in our societies right now. And that's what we're here to talk about today. And I hope we can also use this as an opportunity to come together, the many of us that are here, the 100 plus, to think about how we can come together to find solutions and to fight that. And this is really at its heart what the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, or ISD, is all about. They talk about themselves as not a think tank, but a think-do tank. So it's not just about research, it's about translating that research into action, engagement on the ground with communities and civil society organizations and governments, and other work to actually combat the rising tide of polarization, extremism, and hate. And it's really extraordinary work, and we're lucky to have several from the leadership of ISD and some of their friends here today. So I'm now, after that long prologue, going to introduce our guests. And they're all here in the chat. So as I introduce you, maybe just wave wildly or do something obnoxious so people can see that you're there. And we'll start with Sasha Havlicek. She's the founder and CEO of ISD. So she spearheaded all of their phenomenal portfolio of research and engagement work. Her background is in conflict resolution, and she has expertise in extremism, digital information operations, electoral interference, and has advised governments, multilaterals, the big tech companies, has testified before Congress in the US and Parliament in the UK. And once you meet her, you realize you see her on TV a lot too, talking about this stuff. Sasha's joined here by Zahed Amanullah. I hope I'm doing okay with your names. Zahed is a resident senior fellow at ISD, and he leads the kind of do part of the work as I understand it. So that's really the civil society engagement and partnerships with folks on the ground who can actually fight back against some of the things that they're studying. So Zahed coordinates their public and private sector work with activists, with frontline workers, with civil society networks to counter disinformation, hate, and extremist propaganda. His work's taken him all over the world. I think that's probably true for all of them, but has done work in Kenya with the elections there a couple of years ago, here across Europe and the UK, as well as the Middle East. And here in the UK, worked with Google.org to oversee a £1 million innovation fund for UK civil society organizations. So welcome, Zahed. And the third colleague from ISD is Chloe Colliver. Chloe leads the digital research unit. That's a very timid wave. You got to be more expressive if you want people to see you, Chloe. Thank you. So Chloe oversees the digital research unit. What does that mean? That means that this unit analyzes malign influence campaigns online and really is kind of maybe the social listening piece of this that we'll talk about. So it incorporates all of ISD's work on disinformation and extremist campaigns that are targeting elections. And as a result of this, she also advises both government and a lot of the big tech companies, your Googles and Twitters, et cetera, on how to respond to this kind of, rising tide. And then finally, Carl Miller. Carl is he's not on my screen, but hopefully he's gesticulating wildly as well. Carl is not part of ISD, but is a close friend and partner of their work. He is an author, a speaker, and a researcher at Demos, which is a think tank based in London. And there he also co-founded the Center for Analysis of Social Media. In addition, Carl's a visiting scholar and a research fellow at King's College in London. He wrote a terrific book out in 2018 called The Death of Gods, The New Global Power Grab. And all of them are going to bring terrific perspective. So let's get into the conversation. Just so you all know, in terms of ground rules, we'll sort of start with a kind of traditional, at least virtual panel discussion, but I do want to make it conversational and informal. You are all welcome to join in as you see fit. You can either type sort of questions or comments into the chat. We'll try to follow along and bring some of those conversations in. There also, if you click participants, there's a raise hand function where you can sort of raise your hand if you want to jump in and speak. And of course, we would love to have you actually, as humans, engage and speak as well. So we'll sort of go around and start a conversation with the four of them and then open it up to the rest of the group a little bit later. Cool, everyone ready to go? All right, so Sasha, let's start with you. Tell us a bit more about what ISD does and what kinds of trends you're seeing around digital disinformation, and maybe begin to sort of tell us, how does COVID kind of fit into the work that you've actually been doing for years?
Peter, thank you so very much for this wonderful introduction. I think you said everything there is to say about ISD, and I'm very grateful to you and your colleagues for hosting us here today. Zahed, Carl, and Chloe are going to tell you all the important and interesting stuff, but I will answer your question, tell you a little bit more about what ISD does, and provide, I suppose, a little bit of the backdrop in relation to what we're seeing today, a little bit of the context around the groups and the mobilization that you've referenced in your introductory remarks, which are important and significant, I think, for all of us to be understanding and responding to together. And this forum, bringing everybody together to look at real world solutions, is extremely important and something that we'd love to address within this session. I am experiencing a couple, I can see my internet connection isn't absolutely brilliant. If it doesn't bother you, I may switch off the video and speak to you without the video on. Would that be okay? Just to make sure that I can continue to be heard.
No problem.
So just a couple of additional words about who we are. I suppose we're a global team. We're a global team of data analysts, of researchers, of policy experts, of practitioners, of activists, and we like to think of innovators. And we have been working now for nearly 15 years. on the one hand, to really understand this rising set of challenges around extremism, hate, polarization, disinformation, and on the other hand, to really look at how we can generate fresh thinking around policy response, and in that context, really to work very directly with governments at the central government level, with local government, with local authorities, to equip them with the evidence base to forge policies and approaches and programming that can genuinely address these issues, to measure and evaluate the impact of that on the ground. And on the other hand, to use that data and insight to work with civil society and to empower the people that really can have an impact on pushing back the tide of these ideas, of these ideologies within the communities in which they're seeing this and which are most affected. And so we work through a combination of education, technology, and communications programs to empower our partners on the ground, youth, practitioners, community influencers of all sorts. And again, some of this work is highly experimental. We're looking at trying to beat off the enormous influence operations we've seen deployed over the last many years. And part of that work now has very much turned to advising governments on the policies and strategies we need in order to mitigate the online harms we face today. And I think it bears mentioning that when we started this work in 2006, we couldn't have imagined the enormous impact that the digital information revolution has had on our lives, on every part of our lives. You know, the fundamental transformation of our information ecosystems, I think, cannot be underestimated, and has, you know, fundamentally overturned factors of power. The ability of a committed few to reach further and faster than ever before, we saw exponentially exploited very quickly by bad actors, a whole range of bad actors, who we've seen to be early adopters of these new technologies, of these new communications methods. And so over the past decade, we've watched a combination of hate groups and extremist movements deploy ever more sophisticated, very international, cross-border propaganda, influence, and recruitment operations. And these are amplified, again, massively amplified, hypercharged by digital technology and by the algorithmic amplification, if you like, of sensationalist content that we see. Amplified and boosted also increasingly by state actors. And I think we've all been privy to that. We built these tools and these methods to track extremist movements at the outset. But when I think the penny dropped around 2016, around the extent that dark influence operations were starting to move, if you like, from the fringes, from the problems we'd seen in the domains of ISIS, for instance, and other extremist movements, into the very center of politics, of the mainstream of our societies, indeed to genuinely challenge democracy. And that penny dropping, I think, brought many more actors to the table to start to try to understand these threats, these challenges, and the bad actors sitting behind what we were seeing. You mentioned Brexit, you mentioned these elections. Now, we were asked at that time to apply the tools and the methodologies that we had built out. And Carl and Chloe will speak more to that infrastructure that we've been building over the last years and how that's been adapted to these issues that we currently see with COVID, to disinformation more broadly. But we were asked to apply those approaches to essentially looking for Russian fingerprinted influence campaigns around elections. This is what everybody was sort of obsessed with figuring out and finding more about. But in reality, what we found was something much more complex. And I think just a couple of words about the trends that we've seen over these last few years in terms of that disinformation space, in terms of actors, in terms of tactics, and in terms of targets. In terms of the actors, while we set about looking for that Russian fingerprint, the picture is much more complex. And we find not only a whole array of other state actors in the mix, and not just the obvious ones. We start to see new entrants into state influence operations. We started to see some interesting developments around Hungarian engagements in the lead up to the European parliamentary elections. I'm sure we're going to see more of that kind of thing. There are many, many countries that are now seeing the benefits of this toolkit that was made available. But it was much broader than that. We saw a combination of non-state, transnational non-state actors, a combination of special interests, US special interests in particular, very, very active in the context of many of these information operations that we've looked at, transnational extremist movements and groups, domestic political parties starting to come into this fray. Suddenly this toolkit becoming democratized in all sorts of ways that we might not have imagined in 2016. Everybody in the mix. And in fact, we started to see more and more, I suppose, a more challenging environment in terms of being able to identify and attribute these types of operations. And it was less and less easy actually to find the fingerprints of Russian disinformation in the ways that we might have before, except through the mouthpieces of their state broadcasting and media operations. And tactically then, in the same way, we've seen a big evolution. Now, tactically, we started out with talking about fake news, fakery. Fake news in terms of, obviously false information and content, and fakery of distribution, sort of obvious botnets and the like. In fact, we saw a trend in the direction of less fakery of content, less fakery of distribution, or less obvious fakery of distribution, much more subtle means of distributing, or rather influencing people's thinking around issues. Media and content sourced from credible environments instead of from not credible environments, but used out of context to paint a picture. I talk about this becoming less a matter of information warfare, more a matter of narrative warfare. And so we saw more subtle means by which these types of influence operations were being deployed. But actually, we're sort of coming full circle. We see the full spectrum of fakery and fakery of distribution in play now with COVID. And again, I think we're seeing again the re-entry of quite blatant, overt state actor disinformation, something that was a little harder to pinpoint in the recent years around elections, for instance. And then the targets, and I think this is absolutely critical for all of us to understand that while we've been focused, largely the funding cycles have been focused around understanding and responding to electoral disinformation, understandably extremely important. What we found was that this same constellation of bad actors, transnational extremist groups, special interests, boosted often by state actors with an interest in undermining cohesion within our societies, undermining liberal democratic norms and frames of thought. We found that same constellation targeting actually every single major progressive international policy agenda of our time.
Wow.
Be it climate change and the policy constituency around that issue set, be it the equality and rights space, be it the migration policy sector, and indeed public health. And we saw from place to place, many parts of the world, that same constellation of actors essentially set out to undermine, to attack, direct attacks on constituencies working on these issues, delegitimation campaigns, harassment campaigns, weaponized hate, and investment in narrative shifts, a sort of investment in the long-term cultural changes needed in order for people to start to accept a different sort of political footing, a different kind of political track. And I think this is really important to keep in mind. What we've just now been looking at with this range of tools in relation to COVID is that all of this constituency is very actively involved in exploiting this crisis. It is not new, of course, for bad actors to exploit crises and weakness. But this is, in a way, the mother of crises. And I think we're going to see this exploited in very, very aggressive ways and in very overt ways by many of these actors. We see a number of critical narratives emerge, and Chloe will speak to some of this more, but anti-migrant and far-right networks are mobilized at scale. White supremacist networks and their calls to violence shouldn't be underestimated. The accelerationist sort of doctrine around the failure of democracy, I think, a really important narrative. We will see long-range challenges to the legitimacy and the efficacy of democracy to deal with these issues. How many people have you heard say the Chinese deal with this better, don't they? And I think that area, that sort of a long-range rehabilitation, bringing in from the cold of authoritarian, of autocratic governance models is perhaps the largest threat we have in terms of lasting implications and impact, and something that I really feel we need to be keeping in mind. And so, with this, what we've seen, the result of all of this is just, very quickly, alongside an exponential spike in violence, and we shouldn't forget that, and that's been, a spike in conflict and hate crime and terrorism around the world. Societies really around the world have been experiencing acute polarization. And we, well before this crisis, but I think we'll see that aggravated. Populists have made significant gains at the ballot box everywhere, and authoritarian nationalism is on the rise. This is what we would refer to as mainstreaming extremism. And so I would say, if we fail to respond, if we leave these trends unchecked, we will be witnessing, I think, a sort of existential threat to free and cohesive civic culture, to open and democratic civic culture. We will see the undermining of democratic institutions. We will be putting our communities at genuine risk of violence and polarization, and we will see the derailing of progress on every major global challenge of our time, from climate change, migration, to public health, which is what we're seeing right now. And so we must respond. And I hope we can discuss this later, but our vision at ISD really has been about building a sort of civic technology infrastructure for a scaled response, for the safeguarding of democracy and human rights in our digital age. And that infrastructure needs to be able to provide a real-time insight, which these tools, by the way, do afford us, into these malign information operations. But we need to build the strategic partnerships needed to be able then to equip those at the front line with those insights, and then to drive strategic response jointly, collectively. So I very much take up the call to arms of the Skoll Foundation's summit this year and say, yes, this is the issue around which we must mobilize. We must connect the dots across all of these sectors of work if we are going to see progress on any of them. Each and every one is existentially threatened, and progress will not happen on them if we don't act.
Wow. Oh, sorry, someone, you want to jump in? Thank you, Sasha. I've been late for the last year or so having nightmares about climate change, and you've just given me a whole new set of nightmares. Really, what a masterful overview, and thank you. I think there's so much that I want us to dig into with the rest of the group, but one of the things that I think is a really important takeaway, that for a lot of us kind of more casual observers of this stuff, is that you can see sort of the misinformation campaign in Brexit or in the US election in 2016 or in some other places as kind of isolated things, and maybe they seem a little bit similar. But what you're painting is a picture of a long-term sort of war, asymmetric warfare that's happening with this kind of loose collective of state and non-state actors that are kind of fighting a long game, and we're maybe reacting to this in a given situation here or there, but that we need to start paying more attention and thinking about this over the long term. Fascinating. I want to turn to Carl next. So Carl, you've done a lot of work on the rise of dark influence. Start off by telling us, the title of this session is on social listening. So what is social listening, and talk a little bit about the both what you're seeing and what kinds of systems you've needed to put in place to be able to do the kind of social listening that you think is important.
All right, well, thanks very much, Peter, and hello there, everyone. Thanks so much for having me as part of this panel as well. I'm not a massive fan of the phrase social listening, and that might be a good place to begin, is to explain exactly why.
I thought it was the opposite of social distancing, but you can correct it.
So social listening as a I suppose an industry, a toolkit, a body of tools and an approach kind of owes its roots to the first kind of sector of commercial life, which realized that social media was going to be not only an agent of social change, but an amazing way of actually studying society. And that was marketing and advertising. So as kind of Twitter and other kind of open kind of social media platforms began to grow and began to offer data, this kind of new niche emerged of marketing and advertising platforms which kind of consumed the data which these social media platforms were providing and making available, and then trying to listen to it all, of course, and turn it into some kind of cognizable series of insights. Initially, of course, this was largely being produced to brands to understand share of voice, to understand sentiment analysis, to understand how campaigns were going down, and largely lots of the platforms which are social listening platforms which are still being used today kind of owe in one way or another some kind of legacy to that origin, both in the way in which they approach the study of social media and the kinds of things that they actually produce, which I don't think is actually particularly useful. I don't think it's particularly useful to, and I think for a long time, kind of civic society especially has been kind of trapped by the kind of tools that we've had available to us to actually go out and study social media. Of course, we, like lots of other parts of society, were reasonably late to the big data party. We didn't have as much money as the tech giants. We didn't have all the skills and developers that lots of other parts of the economy did. Many of us were from the humanities disciplines. We desperately tried to pivot as the digital world became more important, but we were large steamships that took a long time to change course, if in fact we have actually ever really changed course. And that meant that as ISD and other organisations like it began to try and confront and tackle these new kinds of problems, which we saw had massive social and political consequences, but were largely erupting and happening and needed to be confronted in one way or another online, we were left with this kind of series of tools called social listening to do it. And that was a massive problem, because suddenly researchers had to deal with social and political phenomena, the study of them, using tools which were made for marketers and advertisers. And we began to learn that sentiment analysis was quite good if you were trying to learn about how people were talking about trainers, and it was absolutely awful if you were trying to learn about how extremists were trying to subvert a political process. And I think that's the kind of situation which, ISD and others, we began to try and change. I think the kind of like the vision now is that we have to create a new thing which isn't actually necessarily just social listening. It's something which looks a lot more like a kind of social media science, if you will. It kind of borrows some ideas from social science, the principles around how human beings, whether they are online, offline, or on any other forum, can be reliably and robustly understood. We've got a century of experience in thinking about that. It borrows some things from the muscular suite of kind of data analytics technologies, which have grown ever more powerful and ever more available, in fact, for people outside of data science to actually use. And it kind of, I think, like the enormous kind of potential which civic society now has is we can borrow from both those two disciplines to create in general, say, which is borrowing from both of those two disciplines to create something which, in a sense, is also trying to do the things that the tech giants are doing, but trying to do it in a completely different way with completely different ends and interests, and likely different approaches. So as Sasha says, and I think it's completely right, this is a
Carl, not sure if you can hear me. You're just freezing up on us. Sorry, you just froze up on us. Maybe switch off your video and then just
sorry.
repeat that last point.
All right, here's my voice. Wave desperately, not that I'll pick up the image if I break up again. So basically, lots of people have realised around the world, from autocratic states through to extremists, that these online spaces where we're now living and where we're being influenced are far easier to gain than to stop being gained, far easier to spread disinformation than to detect it, and that means that up to now, civic society has essentially been a spectator in this battle. You know, we've been sat there watching, on the one hand, the bad actors, you know, developing a tradecraft and using that tradecraft more and more and more, and on the other hand, the tech giants trying to protect their platforms, of course, trying to keep people safe, but doing so, you know, balancing that against a series of other commercial concerns, not necessarily able to do so in ways which are straightforwardly transparent, and of course resistant to intervention into this battle from other political bodies or from necessarily civic society. That's largely been the dynamic. So there's obviously a desperate need for civic society to transform itself from being a spectator into something else. And I think that, like so many other things, coronavirus has simply accelerated and made obvious something which was already true and already kind of happening. So,
go ahead.
So just to finish off, like, rather than social listening, we need, I think, some kind of civic societal kind of digital defense kind of capability or platform or discipline. It can approach the same kind of problem of defending platforms in all the ways in which civic society has strengths and the tech giants do not. You know, we can find ways of radically open sourcing the models that we build. We can find ways of using not tens or hundreds, but thousands and tens of thousands of volunteers and activists to source the information. We can find ways of creating and training technology which is far more varied and diverse and broad-based than anything the tech giants would even try to do, let alone have done. And of course, we have many other levers at our disposal when it comes to actually confronting this. You know, everything from counter narratives all the way through to legislative and political change. So I'll stop there. But that's the kind of space that I think has existed for civic society to step into for a long time. And I think that now more than ever, as we see this enormous struggle for truth erupt around coronavirus, it's becoming patently obvious to all of us that we need to step into that space more decisively and more urgently than we've ever had to in the past.
One follow-up question. Can you just briefly try to explain to the sort of dinosaurs like myself, why is it that it's so much easier to spread the stuff around than it is for the companies who run these platforms to stop it? You talked about, obviously, there's some maybe competing interests, commercial, political, otherwise, but why is that they can't just stop it?
So there's lots of reasons. How long do we have? I mean, the primary one is to do with the way the platforms are designed. So every tech giant has an incredibly important team, usually called something like growth. And it's the point of this team to make their platforms have as many users and as much use as they possibly can. And from the very beginning, there are a series of kind of architectural design principles which growth teams have understood to be really important. And the most important one of those is get rid of all friction. make everything really easy to do, make these platforms really easy to join, really easy to do stuff in, really easy to interact with everyone else. And in a frictionless environment, everything is easier to do than it is to spot. Very little information required to join, space is largely anonymous, transaction cost of doing anything almost nothing. And that means that, you know, to create
Carl, I'm sorry. I think we've lost you.
I'm sorry, I think I accidentally muted myself in full flow. In a nutshell, Peter, frictionless environments are just that everything is easier to do. It's easier to do good stuff and it's easier to do bad things. But detection, actually very difficult. Detection is all about spotting patterns. It's all about trying to, at scale, find things which other people want to be hidden. So it's often to do with models, it's to do with scaled heuristics, it's dueling maths. And fundamentally, mathematically speaking and at scale, it's just easier to hide patterns than it is to find them. It's easier to add noise than it is to find signal.
Fascinating. I want to just stay on that thread for a minute and move to Chloe, because you're obviously very much working in this space as well. Maybe first question is, this is just an observation. It feels to me like the big sort of tech companies, at least with regards to social media, have been a little bit more visibly aggressive in trying to mediate and moderate and stop some of the disinformation around COVID-19 than I've seen in the past. And I wonder whether, because at least up until now, COVID-19 as a sort of insidious virus has been relatively apolitical, whether it's safer for them to sort of go after that than it is to say go after right-wing extremist propaganda, where you're sort of seen as taking sides in a political debate. You think there's any merit to that observation?
I think there's certainly merit to it, and the policies that have changed just in the past month from a number of these major tech companies show that this it has the potential to be a game-changing moment for how seriously companies are taking mis and disinformation on their platforms. However, the pessimist in me doesn't want to jump to too many conclusions about that, and some of the data that we've seen already coming out of our research around coronavirus shows that while on the more public spaces on a lot of these platforms, there seems to be quite a successful effort in many ways to deal with some of the most obvious kinds of egregious disinformation and conspiracy theories, that actually in a lot of the spaces where people are spending the most time, in closed Facebook groups and WhatsApp chats, the problem is seismic still, and there remains an enormous amount to be done. And I think that we're only going to get into a more difficult position with this crisis around disinformation and coronavirus as it becomes more and more political. I think you're entirely right on that front. But what was interesting to me this week was the decision of Twitter and Facebook to prevent tweets and live streaming from Bolsonaro in Brazil when it was identified that he included misinformation and disinformation about cures around coronavirus in his content. That is a line that we've very rarely seen the platforms step up to in the consistency of their enforcement around disinformation. That level of enforcement where influencers, public figures, officials have fallen prey to the same rules of the game as other users has previously not really been one that we've seen happen. But in this scenario, they are taking it seriously enough that kind of action has been taken. So that's kind of a two-sided answer to your question, I realize. I think the optimist in me says this is proof to both to governments and the public and the media that these companies can, when they put their heads to it, do an awful lot more to deal with these problems than they have been to date. And that the admission that they're making now is we do have some of the resources and power at our disposal to deal with some of these issues more seriously. And that they will therefore continue to do so or be pressured to do so by governments. The pessimist in me says that we may also be moving into a context in which we become so reliant once again on the services of a few major technology platforms to work from home, to communicate, to speak to family, friends, to use services, that we forget to enforce oversight and transparency on these massive corporate behemoths that will then have even more control over our lives and the information that we use within them than they did before. So I think there's a number of directions this could take, and we need to be really careful to make sure we are, as civil society, trying to provide as much transparency and oversight over what's really going on across the platforms, whether it be e-commerce and Amazon selling books about fake coronavirus cures, all the way through to Viber and WhatsApp groups spreading conspiracies about Bill Gates, like your friend might have seen.
Wow. And we're going to keep on that thread, because I think that, one of the things we're seeing in the response to the pandemic is obviously putting a lot of almost unprecedented power and authority in the hands of government leaders, some who have some autocratic tendencies. And I thought that when, sort of Trump declared a national emergency, that what wasn't talked about a lot was that he could do almost anything. He could nationalize the media. He could do a lot of other things that he might like to do, and no one could stop him. And at the same time, we're starting to see some really clever apps for contact tracing that monitor all of our whereabouts on smartphones. And Singapore used that really successfully to help control their epidemic. And now they're starting to pop up elsewhere in the world. And I imagine there are real questions around how those data are being used and who's controlling them, and those kinds of things. So this is a place where some of the cures might be almost as bad as the disease potentially.
Well, exactly. And I think the lack of transparency across various governments in how they're now working with various mobile phone providers, data services, different technology companies, whether it be Palantir, O2, AT&T, whoever it is, the fact that we have no oversight over whether those relationships will continue once this crisis is over is the thing that's really concerning for both privacy advocates, but also just for users themselves. And the level of surveillance that is now being enabled in order to hopefully save lives, we have no idea whether that will continue afterwards for more nefarious purposes. There's also been an enormous amount of cybercrime, an increase in the kinds of hacks and spam and attempts to kind of wean money out of people, profiteering off the crisis online as people move their lives ever more onto online platforms, using online payment, all sorts of things. So I think there are a number of risks that currently aren't top priority necessarily in people's minds, that in the long run we need to be confronting to make sure that the balance of health and safety is being outweighed by privacy and civil rights.
Thank you. Zahed, I want to turn to you and talk about what we can do about all of this. And so you've been on the forefront of working with folks on the front lines, with communities and civil society organizations to combat this. So talk about how at ISD you're translating some of your research into toolkits for action. Maybe give an example of how that's worked successfully, and talk about how you can take some of the things that you're learning there and apply it to our current moment.
Sure. I think it's easy for us to get caught up in the sort of analysis of this from a bird's eye perspective, and lose track of the issue that this has real impact on the ground with real people. And whatever the solution is, whether it involves there's a tech aspect, there's a policy aspect, a research aspect, it will definitely involve a civil society aspect. It will definitely involve the participation of groups on the ground that are suffering from the byproducts of this phenomenon. For us at ISD, for many years, it's really been tracking the way that groups promote hate against different communities, whether it's the far right or Islamist groups and so forth. And as Sasha's mentioned and Carl's alluded to, that there's in a crisis situation, this is when all of this amplifies. I mean, a lot of our work, for example, we've been studying a lot of our theories around elections as this time when a lot of this stuff was amplified. Again, a whole bunch of different actors working, loosely together, sort of to promote division and hate more specifically. And we've studied this throughout Europe, Middle East, and you mentioned in Kenya, where we did a project for a couple of years, and the patterns are all very similar, even if the tactics differ, and the our challenge has been to try to translate how what our findings lead us to conclude as far as strategies are concerned with the capabilities and the insight and the wherewithal of civil society groups on the ground. And I'll give a couple of examples. First, now with the COVID crisis, you know, in terms of manifestations of hate, you know, one of the big spikes that we've seen is, you know, a rise in hate incidences against people of East Asian ancestry, Chinese Americans, and so forth. There's a great site, AAPI, Asian American Pacific Islanders Hate, that has logged, I think, 650 incidences in the last 2 weeks, all related to fear generated around COVID. Like, that's a very explicit example of how this online instigation really, brings about offline harm to real people. So I think that's what we need to keep in mind the most, that this isn't all academic. This is something that involves society writ large. So we work with communities of all backgrounds, and, you know, I can give a lot of instances for those in Muslim communities, which I've been working closely with for many, many years. And their place in this, you know, we've been working very closely with them anyway regarding hate around elections upcoming in the US, but also in other countries. And it's generally the same. Whenever there's a crisis, it's an opportunity for their efforts to do their civic society work, whether it's involvement in the political space or otherwise, to be attacked and targeted. And, you know, most of the organizations that I've spoken to in the last few weeks, COVID has been an amplifier of those activities. And it's a little bit ironic, because a lot of the organizations, part of their strategy to push back against the hate is to promote a narrative online that counters the narrative that's been used against them since the Muslim ban, you know, especially over the last couple of years. And it creates this unvirtuous cycle where, you know, that visibility increases the opportunities to, you know, to marginalize them further. In the UK, you know, in the last few days, there's been a number of videos, for example, circulating on Twitter of Muslims praying in the streets, and with a proclamation that they're putting everyone at risk of COVID by insisting on congregating, when the opposite is true. Actually, they all shut down, and the videos are from years past. And in fact, we've had police departments come out and disavow them, you know, taking that stand. So, you know, the people who want to promote hate never, you know, miss a crisis as an opportunity to amplify this stuff. You know, some of the responses, you know, that I've seen from civil society organizations that are specifically COVID related are basically along the lines of demonstrating that they are part of the community and trying to promote solutions in alignment with other communities. And, you know, so for example, Muslims, the first 3 doctors to die in the UK were Muslim immigrant backgrounds. So like that alone like counters that narrative. And people have been promoting that as a way to get in front of the curve and try to show that not only are we all in this together, but everyone is doing their part to fight against this. And, you know, that proactive effort is not come easily. We've produced toolkits, for example, so that organizations on the ground can very effectively understand how to craft these narratives, how to put them out there on social media platforms. We worked in partnership with the social media platforms to do this effectively. And we've been able to measure impact from that. We've been able to measure that, you know, getting civil society organizations working with their existing capabilities and supplementing their capabilities with other resources can move the needle when it comes to changing public opinions about these minority groups. So, you know, and these strategies, we've tested them all over with a youth network that we run called Youth Can all over the world, and so forth. So, you know, the more that we improve these systems, really the only question then is how many civil society organizations can we reach out to and get them on board so that everyone is participating together? Because this is a cultural shift that we're having. This is really a battle for the culture of, you know, working together, of global citizenship versus the culture of tribalism and division that really is threatening us all. So that really is the strategy that we're taking. There's a lot to do yet. We're just learning from our, the experiments that we've done, but all of them have been very promising. And so we need partners to, and nothing can be done without, partnerships across tech and across civil society and the private sector and foundations as well. We need everyone to work together to sort of help, make these tools available to everyone.
Thank you. Just a couple of questions for all of you or any of you as we open it up. And for all of you then out there, please feel free to enter questions or comments right into the chat, or there'll be an opportunity if you want to try to raise your hand. And if I'm able to see you and give you a chance to speak, that would be terrific as well. We've already got some great questions. I know there's a lot of collective experience and wisdom in the room as well, and we want to make sure that we can hear from you if you've got something to say. So first off, for any of you, but to pick up on what you just said, Zahed, one of my big takeaways is we need to get on a long-range footing here because we're countering sort of an enemy that may be loosely organized, but they've got a long-range kind of horizon with their efforts. And clearly that's animating your work. Who else out there is demonstrating that kind of dogged long-term perspective and maybe is a green shoot or a bright spot of hope? Is there a particular government, foundation, other organizations? Who can you sort of point to who gets this and is doing something about it?
Maybe to come in on this, Peter, if I may, I think you're absolutely right. The problem is that we're seeing a lot of reactive and siloed work being done, siloed across different sectors and so on. And we desperately need proactive and networked solutions. I mean, that is essentially why these bad actors have succeeded in being so influential. And what we desperately need is an integrated system so that we are, on the one hand, all seeing the problem in a way, in the same way, which is to say, we need the data system, which is opened up to all the partners working across these issue sets that are under attack today. That is the one side of, I think, the challenge. And I just want to mention that as we have sought to build out our data systems in terms of looking across many, many, many different platforms, integrating analysis across the digital space, we are now integrating a crowdsourced element of that data system. This is really important because it gives us an opportunity to work with those at the front line of an issue set with the real experience and expertise around that issue set. So say, people working in the migration sector are most likely to be privy to or indeed experience disinformation and attack. If we can work with them to provide those insights, which is something that we're doing right now in the context just of disinformation in the lead up to the US election, we're trialing a major piece of crowdsourced data from frontline organizations across the US that will give us a sense of how effective that can be. But imagine being able to get those partnerships in place to be able to provide that crowdsourced data system, in addition to the digital analysis that we're doing, both across mainstream, but also in the darker web, across these closed fora platforms where we need to be listening in to the plotting and scheming that happens often by bad actors in those spaces. So integrating all of that, somebody's asked, but how do we trust that data? That's the whole point of building open source tools and not just going with commercial off-the-shelf stuff, is really to be able to say, we want this to be open to interrogation by peers, by academics, by partners, so that we can get behind the data. And so we must build this system in a way that enables proper interrogation of the data. But we must build it in partnership. And then there is the question of what you do with it. On the proactive side of this, I think there's two things here. There is a policy agenda that we need to come around, which is really around how we regulate our new information ecosystem, how we regulate the tech platforms and really create an information ecosystem that supports our liberal democratic values and doesn't undermine them. And I'd love Chloe to talk a little bit about what that means, but it's really about shining the spotlight of transparency around the way in which the infrastructure of the platforms works. That algorithmic sort of bias to extreme messaging, to sensationalist messaging, is distorting the level playing field, if you like, of speech today. We need to get to the bottom of that. That's the one side. And on the other hand, we need to use this data platform and onboard partners across these different sectors, migration, climate, rights, health, so that we're starting to enable strategic responsiveness, both through communications, but also just from a defensive perspective. If we can get the information in real time to an organization that is about to be targeted by an information operation, we can get them resilient to that attack. There's early warning systems that can be put in place. They can start to work to preempt some of that, both from an information operations perspective, but also sometimes in relation to actual targeted attack, intimidation. So there's a lot we can do together on this front. And I think that the climate sector, in many ways, has been, you asked for a good example, in many ways has been ahead of the curve on this, because the climate sector has mobilized a massive networked operation that has approached the issue both from a policy standpoint and from a cultural change perspective. They've looked to shift the way in which we think and behave around this set of issues, and they have done that with sizable investment in communications infrastructure.
Interesting. Chloe, anything you want to pick up on there?
Yeah, I was just kind of come back to your question on good examples. I mean, I think there's an enormous amount of really interesting digital research being done in either on specific platforms or around specific techniques. So, there are really wonderful teams at different universities. For example, we can look at NYU's Cybersecurity Center, who do really amazing work looking specifically at political ads online and the different ways those can be interrogated, how we can find out more about what's going on, where they're being misused and abused, for example. But that's one sliver of the pie. You can look forward to other universities or think tanks or institutions who are doing really interesting work looking particularly at Facebook, cross-posting on Facebook groups, to try and understand where there's inauthentic community work going on that we can't see. So we've been trying to talk to a bunch of different partners and groups to see the different methods, the different approaches that are being taken and where those have been successful so far. And Carl and I together did some of that evaluation work at the end of last year to think through, what has worked to date. There are definitely things and approaches that are being trialed and tested that are really effective and efficient at finding different kinds of information operations and different kinds of distorted behavior. How can we try and now build a system that tries to bring some of those different approaches together a bit more? And I think we're getting there, and I'm optimistic that actually across a bunch of different civil society organizations, think tanks and academia, the approaches are there. They're just currently being trialed and tested in silos and not in a holistic whole. So I do think there's reason for optimism if we can get the kind of partnerships and support in place that will mean that those things can come together a bit more successfully.
Great. Interesting question here from Marikan, which I'll just summarize or paraphrase a little bit, that there's a tendency in trying to counter some of this discourse and misinformation to use arguments that might target people on sort of one side or the other, rights-based, market-based, system and crisis type arguments, but arguably that discourse doesn't target people in what they call the persuadable or silent middle. In what ways are you taking into account the underlying moral values when drafting interventions?
And this is a really interesting question. We've had to address it in relation to the work that we've done on extremist constituencies. How on earth would you dissuade somebody who has already signed up to an extremist ideology through, practical sort of myth busting? Essentially doesn't work in this space. It is largely about the person that is engaging with that constituency and their credibility, so credible voices, and it is largely around an empathetic human outreach. We've tested sorts of approaches to those types of conversations on a one-to-one basis with people who are highly skeptical or opposed to the views that one might be wanting to put forward. And it is extraordinary what can be done through direct outreach and empathetic engagements by people who may be credible in those contexts. Now, there are influencers, proxy influencers into all of these types of spaces that I don't think we've sought to properly engage and deploy in this context. But you need to find those proxy influencers. We've talked a lot about, engaging veterans associations, engaging unions, engaging church groups, those types of organizations that may naturally have an engagement with constituencies that may be skeptical and have resonance with those audiences. I think that there's a bigger job to be done on thinking through how one engages, and emotive human engagements simply work better than factual, evidentiary, nice scientific, fact-based type engagements.
Yeah, I think that's a truism. Feel free to counter extremism by tweeting really positive things about this session using the hashtag #SkullGoesVirtual. Question here from former far-right members have told our organization, maybe she or he can tell us who, that the main problem is that members of these groups, presumably extremist groups, feel they're not being listened to. And so we need to start by listening to what they have to say. How are you addressing this without encouraging or giving platform or voice to those opinions?
I think there's let me, Peter, if I may jump in.
Of course.
There's a great deal of confusion still around what is the problem we are in fact actually trying to confront here. There's one kind of problem set, which is the fact that extremists have suddenly gained the tools which previously were only held by mainstream political parties and actors, which is the tools of mass mobilisation and messaging. Suddenly they can reach everyone, be part of the conversation and organise in ways which were impossible before the age of digital technology. Then there is another, which is this kind of idea of dark influence. And I think it's very important that we begin to disaggregate the propagation of political ideology online, which is one thing, from the way in which any political ideology is being argued for or being propagated or being spread online, which is another thing. They're two separate interlocked problems, of course, but actually distinct in terms of what they're really doing. And I think quite a lot of what we're doing is the way in which illegitimate political ideologies are also being spread and propagated and defended and kind of vouchsafed in ways which are themselves illegitimate. So it's an uneven playing field, both in what the message is, but also especially how that message is being spread. And quite a lot of the problem here is that not only are kind of far-right extremist groups, far-left extremist groups, radical Islamist groups, autocratic states got a bad message to tell us, but they have built capabilities to exploit and undermine the online forums and thoroughfares, which we're now, especially in the age of coronavirus, living even more than we did before, in ways which we are not capable of. We don't know, we're not even aware that they are happening. And when we do pull them apart, we know are actually extremely effective and extremely subtle. And the last thing I'd like to throw in here is that of this grab bag of illegitimate ways of spreading any message that you want, which I think is actually a kind of part of, a kind of overlooked part of this entire issue. Much of that actually isn't necessarily even really to do with misinformation or disinformation. When you kind of interview influence purveyors, people that have done these kinds of work, which I've tried to do, very little of their campaigns really are to do with the explicit propagation of a falsifiable lie. Much more often it's to do with cherry picking some truths, wrapping them into suggestions, leaving a hanging question, and simply then being able to control how people spend attention. You can build an extremely distorted picture of the world simply through selecting some facts over other facts and allowing some facts to kind of bounce off and other facts to enter an information ecosystem. We don't have the vocabulary, all the definitions, all the concepts, all the categories to even really fully describe this world yet, let alone confront it. So far-right extremism online is one thing, and that's an older problem. The ways in which far-right extremists and lots of other bad actors have found ways of exploiting online spaces to become more influential than they should be is a second problem, and that's a newer one.
I think that degree of sophistication must make it so much more difficult to counteract. For those of you who spend a lot of time in some of these darker corners of cyberspace, it must get difficult, sometimes. It must also get kind of quirky and outrageous sometimes. And I'm just curious whether you might share any of the more kind of out there, just plain weird or amusing stories or threads around COVID-19 that you've encountered.
I mean, I've got one from just yesterday that I can kick off with. We were digging into Facebook pages that were simultaneously sharing content about migrants and COVID-19 at the same time to attack migration and migrants themselves. And we were looking through the various sources where that information was taken from, and one of the websites that we came across was called blazingcatfur.com, which posted an enormous amount of anti-migrant content, and in the right-hand side had Donald Trump's Twitter feed on an RSS feed, but the whole thing was covered with pictures of cats. So that made it slightly more enjoyable to read, if not very. So that's my one of the day.
The anti-5G movement is another curiosity, which I never really expected to become central to geopolitics. Kind of another bizarre one. Previously a kind of reasonably niche part of the internet, which was skeptical about the safety of 5G, probably was the first community to become utterly convinced that the story of the origins of coronavirus was in fact completely false. Somehow I think the story was that because of the cruise ship used 5G or early 5G technology, that was really where the coronavirus originated. And anyway, they kind of seemed to attract a large kind of coterie of other people that also thought coronavirus origin, the official coronavirus origin story was bunkum. So we now have a kind of weird, menagerie of some people that began life hating 5G and now hate the coronavirus narrative, and others that hate the coronavirus narrative and now hate 5G.
And we'll throw Bill Gates and the cruise ship in there for good measure. And
he is quite literally involved in the 5G conspiracy.
Yeah.
If I could add one, it's really been just the proliferation of disinformation around COVID-19 on WhatsApp and similar groups, on cures and so forth. I've just noticed this on a number of different perspectives, but from my family, which goes which is in India and Pakistan and otherwise, the amount of misinformation, a lot of it innocently forwarded, but some of it disregarding the very real steps that we all know that we have to take to prevent COVID-19 transmission being spread about. Some of it obviously false, others harmless but misleading. It's enormous, and because when we haven't talked about WhatsApp in particular as an encrypted platform where a lot of this disinformation can take place unhindered because of the nature of the platform itself. It's one of those challenges that we have to, I myself, I'm the sort of the fact checker in chief when it comes to all the groups that I'm in. But people, you see that, a lot of people, it's a coping mechanism for a lot of people, and you have to realize that there is, that human aspect of trying to tread carefully on how to guide, people through this maze of disinformation. It can be a tricky one.
Could I just come in, Peter, because there are a couple of really interesting questions around education and critical thinking, which I think are really important. And we've certainly, as one of the responses to these problems looked to build educational resources both for schools, for teachers in school situations, but also in informal educational settings. Digital citizenship education. How do we get people both understanding what harm looks like online, and really more about the way in which the technological infrastructure can lead you inorganically to certain spaces and content that you may not realize is in fact inorganic. But also, how do you start to respond to that? What is your role in creating a positive environment? We have educational tools and resources, for that, and would love to share them. I don't think they go far enough, and they are piecemeal. We have not universalized digital citizenship education in our countries. And of course, it doesn't deal with the adult educational problem, because this is all, of course, for kids, where we have this enormous challenge in terms of adult digital citizenship education. We're starting to look at whether and ways in which we might partner with companies, employers, to do more of that in terms of workplace-based training and provisions. I think that's going to be absolutely critical over time, so that people are abreast of what this is and what it looks like and what they might be able to do to respond to it. And then I think that there are some interesting, again, crowdsourced opportunities. Damien Collins has launched this Monday something called Infotagion, where, again, he's asking the public to send in whatever they see that might be suspicious, and is hoping to get fact checkers to be able to turn that around. And we will be doing some of the analysis on the back end of that. But getting that back into public fora, I think there are ways in which to do this.
Thank you. So many great questions here that we're unfortunately not going to be able to get to. I want to make sure we finish a few minutes before the half hour so folks can get to other sessions. As a sort of final word for each of you, could you share one takeaway, one opportunity, one thing we need to do to start to get ahead of the curve here? That could be strategy, that could be something technological, it could be something social, whatever. And or one thing that gives you hope, so we can hopefully finish on a slightly optimistic note here. Anyone can start.
I mean, I am entirely hopeful about all of this. I mean, I think that human beings in general and civic society specifically are amazingly inventive and ingenious beings. Like, very obviously, we need to create a capability which we do not have. In part, it's a societal and organizational one. In part, it's a technological and analytical one. But we cannot sit on the sidelines and continue to watch very large commercial companies struggle with autocracies and far political extremists, with us having nothing to say about it, not being able to hold everyone up to account, not being able to form our own views, not being able to feed empirical, robust results into policymakers and guide the formation of new laws and policies for governments across the world. We need to step in that space, and I think we will. But as usual, like, if a crisis isn't necessarily always something which changes the world, it certainly is something, I think, which clears away a lot of fog of uncertainty and clarifies what really needs to be done. And I think the coronavirus kind of immediate reaction on the internet has definitely clarified, I think, beyond now all question, the need of civic society to begin to look very carefully about how it can create this capacity and capability in a way which is genuinely transparent, networked, global.
If I could share a note of optimism from some research I was doing yesterday with our team in France, who were looking at the sad slew of anti-Asian racism that they're seeing in French online at the moment. But one of the findings that they initially started to see, actually, from looking into the kind of volumes of content that were targeting mostly the Chinese French community, was actually an enormous amount of organic and quite highly engaged with kind of pushback on that racism online, and that huge parts of the peaks of the volume of this conversation were in fact civil society groups, media, influencers calling out that activity and behavior and getting traction with the calling out of that behavior. So even just in these kind of nastier and smaller corners of the internet, seeing the light that is coming through and that people are coming together in these times to make sure that this kind of narrative isn't the one that wins out, I think is something we all need to cling on to. Yeah,
just on that point, I want to reinforce that point somewhat. I've spoken to so many civil society organizations over the last few weeks. And it's easy for us to think of civil society as a homogenous entity. You know, you often have some civil society organizations at odds with each other on strategies and what have you. But on this issue, they're very aligned. And there was a question about the capacity of civil society organizations. They are extremely distressed in terms of their ability to function. But what is not lacking is their enthusiasm and their eagerness to get in front of the problem and their openness to working with more people themselves than they had in the past. And then we've seen this manifest itself just on a neighborhood level around the world, how neighborhoods are getting together to support each other. So that human instinct is coming out, whether it's a survival instinct or otherwise, but it's also an empathetic instinct that we haven't seen lately in the age of polarization. So I'm very optimistic on that front, that we will find that empathy that's within all of us and hold on to that moving forward.
And Narcy, just to say, I'm hugely optimistic. I'm structurally optimistic. I have to be, having done this work for far too long now. But this is why, crises are transformative times, but this is unique, really, in our generation. We are experiencing collectively, globally, this crisis. And that experiential global phenomenon is giving us the opportunity to focus and concentrate our minds around the transformation we wish to see happen. And it is simply a question of focusing and organizing ourselves. And I believe that actually now, with the sort of pause on life that this is necessitating, there is no excuse for us not to do that. But we are in a position, because we have the technological wherewithal, we have the tools, we are now in a position to understand collectively, globally, the need for a response that's proactive rather than just reactive, or we will see these bad actors win out. I believe that you only need to really fire up a small minority of the majority to tip us in the direction of a genuine solution. And so I would just end by saying, I would be really, we are really, we need help. We all need to be connecting the dots to do this. And we are really, really keen on and eager for a conversation with anybody that is interested to work together in this direction. We know that everybody's stretched, and we know that everybody has their own issue sets to address. But I think that this is a systemic problem, and it will affect all of us and all of our different issue sets and all of our work. And so there is, I think, a real need for and an opportunity for us now to work together in that capacity. We are very much open door and look forward to further conversations to see if we can make that happen.
Fantastic. That's a great note to end on. So thank you to all of you for being a part of this conversation and for sticking around through it all. In particular, thanks to Sasha, Chloe, Carl, and Zahed for your terrific insights. It was a real wake-up call for me and a fascinating conversation. We will be sharing this recording and some notes from it as well. And in fact, the Skoll Foundation are trying to compile some notes with kind of rapid insights from every session this week and post it in a common Google Doc. Be in touch if you can't find that, but most of what you need is on the Skoll virtual forum page. And again, you can sign up to join that digital community and continue the conversations that were started here with one another. Finally, if you do want to get in touch with ISD Global, Uberta has helpfully added into a chat an email address that you can reach out to if you want to further the conversation and potentially join in their work. So thank you all again. Thank you to the School Center team, to Lydia and Zainab in particular for helping to organize all of this. And please do come back again soon, and we appreciate your time. Thanks.